So in our office, what we do, and we have approximately 800 patients with these devices at this point. It's a tremendous undertaking, and up until January 1st, it was not reimbursed by Medicare. It is now, but not very much. But in any event, so we monitor these patients with these devices, and each one who's downloaded, we transmit the device information is sent to our electrophysiology clinic, sent to our heart failure clinic. A nurse practitioner reviews that. If the impedance values are normal, that's great. We don't need to do anything. If the impedance values are abnormal, it generates a phone call from the nurse practitioner to the patient. How are you feeling? What are you doing? Are you gaining any weight? Are you short of breath? Are you taking your pills? Are you watching your diet? And I can tell you we've had tremendous success with this system, and the readmission rate to Lancaster General Hospital for heart failure in patients with these devices is amongst the lowest in the state. We've published a number of articles about this. This is just one example of a trial that was published 2 years ago, basically showing that the impedance value is predictive of hospitalizations and decompensations. The number of times you cross that threshold that I showed you predicts how often you'll be hospitalized. So it's information that's clinically useful. Our current research interests, first of all, can we utilize remote monitoring to improve patients' outcomes? You know, being in the hospital, nobody likes to be in the hospital. The question is, if you monitor these devices, how often should you monitor these devices? What kind of interventions do you need to make in these devices? Do you need to see the patient? Can you just do this over the phone? Can you say, well, listen, Mr. Smith, I think you should double up on your diuretic because your impedance has changed even though you feel well. I'll tell you that doesn't work, but that's one mechanism that people have used. Can you improve the functional class of the patient? If we are more on top of their disease process, can they be more useful during the day? Will they be more active? Will their exercise capacity be higher? And can we ultimately, in the bottom line, and the holy grail for the work that we do is, of course, mortality. Can you affect their mortality? I've told you that the mortality rate for heart failure is exceedingly high, and if you have better control of their disease, if you treat their symptoms earlier, can you interrupt this otherwise fatal process? How often should patients be monitored? We don't know that. What's the workflow issues involved? It's, I'll tell you, a tremendous investment on the part of my practice to monitor these patients. It's reimbursed a little bit at this point, but not sufficiently to account for all the time and effort we spend on that. So there are considerable economic issues. What about additional sensors? So that's research that was ongoing right now in our practice. These devices, I've showed you the impedance, there's motion detectors, there's respiratory detectors, there's temperature detectors. You can build in all sorts of sensors into these devices, and which sensors will be useful in order to monitor these patients, and indeed what vectors. In fact, the one I've showed you is just one single vector from the defibrillator lead into the generator, the can. But what about different vectors? There's actually three leads in the heart with each of these patients, and maybe alternate vectors using 1 or 2 or 3 different vectors would be even more sensitive. In fact, we're doing a trial right now looking at 3 different vectors and which is the best way to monitor these patients. And so can we improve on what's currently available? Like I said, different vectors and different devices. What infrastructure must be developed to deal with these remote monitors? That is a very difficult, it's somewhat easy to do the bench research and to say, well, which vector is going to be better? But actually, the difficult part is to figure out how to put that into your workflow. Because what you can't afford to do is to slow your process down. It can't be so difficult that it's interesting, but no one's going to do it. And I'll give you an example. There's a device called the Chronicle device, which was made by Medtronic. And what it is a pressure sensor. And it gets implanted in the heart on one of these leads. And what it can give you is real-time measurements of the patient's filling pressures in their heart, which ultimately predicts how much fluid is in their lungs. It's tremendously useful. It's a spectacular research tool, and it's tremendously time-intensive. And it's not something that you can use in clinical practice. And indeed, I've had many discussions with the people who make this device, and I've told them, and they hate to hear this, but the truth is, I look at Chronicle, I look at those pressure sensors, it's kind of like nuclear fusion is to energy. Fusion is the future of energy and always will be. That's the future of heart failure and always will be. It's far too intensive, that kind of minute-to-minute pressure manipulation and monitoring in order to use in clinical practice. It's a great research tool. It's a fantastic research tool, but in our clinical practice, not useful. And then at the end, how do you prove? How do you prove the efficacy of a device, of a diagnostic device? This is a real problem. As opposed to a drug or a procedure, it's relatively easy to prove efficacy or not, because you've given the patient a drug, either he takes it or he doesn't take it, and if the patient does better if he took the drug, then you've proven, in fact, that it's beneficial. But what about a diagnostic tool? There are many levels in that. So not only so you apply the diagnostic tool, you need to interpret the diagnosis. You need to instruct the patient. The patient needs to do what he says, and then only at the end of the day can you say whether or not this diagnostic tool has been useful. That's an entirely different level of proof as opposed to just giving a patient a pill. And so it's very hard to prove that in clinical trials, it's very hard to prove that a diagnostic test actually changes outcome. But the outcome is, in fact, the bottom line. So these are some of the current research trials that we're doing in heart failure. Vitamin Z, as I told you about, alternative vectors using different impedance vectors. CardioMEMS, I'll show you a picture of that. And Chronicle, I already described, which is an implantable pressure sensor. SenseHF is what I was talking about with multiple sensor technology, all built into this device, all transmitted wirelessly over the internet as often as we want. And then care pathways is basically how often do you look at this information? How many times a day or how many times a week or a month should you look at this information, and then once you've looked at it, what should you do with it? This is an example of CardioMEMS. Is very interesting to me. This is a device here that gets embolized off the tip of a catheter, and a patient lays on a pillow at night, and this is a nitinol wire in that device, which vibrates at a certain frequency once radio energy is applied to it, and the frequency of vibration is related to the pressure. And so it's an indirect measurement of the pressure in the blood vessels of the lungs. We get that information every night downloaded to us over in our heart failure clinic when a patient lays on this special pillow. It's a tremendous technology, and it's something I think that will actually be FDA approved. The patient has a defibrillator, by the way, and this is the lead that I was talking about for the defibrillator. So we've published a number of abstracts. I'm not going to bore you with any of that, and a number of publications basically dealing with the kind of research that we do. We have a lot of experience dealing with companies. Most big companies, Medtronic and Boston Scientific, have been the two leaders in this field, have come to us because we have such a large clinical practice. So they develop the technology and we refine it. They give us the tool and we say, hey, by the way, here's how you can use it in a big clinical practice, and that's been our focus.